Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Contemporary Happiness Podcast. In this podcast, what I want to do is I want to go through an exercise of critical thinking. Okay. Now, I think that one of the best topics to apply to this, to use as an example for this exercise of critical thinking is the Israel-Palestine debate. So let's watch Krystal Ball from the Breaking Points podcast, and let's analyze her points on Israel-Palestine. And I'm going to give you my reaction as an attorney to her points on her podcast. So let's get right into it. Okay, so let me share my screen here with you. Let's break it down. Let's go.
Hostage rescue / massacre that occurred over the weekend. We can put this up on the screen. One woman, this is Noah Argamani, who was captured at that Nova Music Festival. And she really became quite famous because there was some horrifying video of her being captured and taken away. She's crying out for her boyfriend. This is one of the other released. But as part of this quote unquote rescue mission, you had just an absolute massacre. One of the deadliest days that we have had in this entire Gaza war. You can see here the rubble, you can see dead bodies, you can see the injured. And reports are that from the health ministry that 274 Palestinians were killed in this effort to rescue the 4 hostages. We can put this up on the screen from the Financial Times. They have some more details about what occurred. Their headline here, Israel's raid to free hostages takes horrific toll on central Gaza. Hundreds of Palestinians killed and injured in gun hostages was a boost, they write, for Netanyahu's government, which has spent the last week arguing whether to agree to a U.S.-backed plan to end the fighting. But the devastating firepower used by Israeli forces also made June 8th the deadliest day for Gazans in months, with the Enclave's health ministry saying the raid, which was accompanied by gun battles and a fierce bombardment, had killed 274 Palestinians and injured 698. One medical chief described the horrific scenes in his hospital. The raid, the director of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital said they came with horrific injuries, torn lower limbs or upper limbs, some with broken skulls, their brains pouring out, some shot in the abdomen, in the intestines. There are women, children, the elderly. Houses have been destroyed and families wiped out.
So I just want to quickly say here right now, we just listened to her for 2 minutes. And basically, she could have saved 2 minutes by saying that there was a devastating loss of life during the rescue mission. First of all, she puts rescue in quotes, which I find despicable. It was a rescue mission. And I get it. There was a devastating loss of life. Now, we don't need all the nitty-gritty details of torn limbs and brains spilling out. War is horrific. We all know this. The purpose of this kind of repetitively describing the anatomy of the deaths and the injuries that happened is so that they can appeal to your emotional sense. They're trying to make you not think logically. If you were going to analyze this issue logically, the only data point that you need is that there was a lot of loss of life on that day. You can even talk about the number, even though the number is to be debated, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this going on about how people were killed and there were babies and some of them were hanging off the staircase and stuff like that, this is what's called war porn. And it's designed to get you off your logical brain and make you think with your primal brain so that you basically abandon your sense of logic and rationale. So you got to be careful about this prolonged soliloquy on, the details, the gory details of what happened.
I also wanted to note from that article, you had the chief Israeli military spokesman, Daniel Hagari, because this is giving credence to those on the Netanyahu side of the equation who say, hey, we don't need a ceasefire, even though that's the way that obviously the largest number of hostages were released by far. And overall, Israel has still killed far more hostages through their military operations than they have rescued. But it's giving credence to this idea of, oh, no, we don't need a ceasefire deal. We can just do this again and just, massacre hundreds of Palestinians to rescue the rest of the hostages. But Daniel Hagari, even the Israeli military spokesman, rejects that view, saying, we know that we cannot do operations to rescue all of them because the conditions won't allow it. We saw already that what brought the biggest number of hostages home was a deal. There is no argument about that. And so, Sagar, it's one more instance where it's just very clear in terms of the U.S. political elite, certainly the Israeli political elite, but with our own political elite, that Palestinian lives just don't count the same way that Israeli lives do. To celebrate this mission, and listen, I think the hostages should be released. I'm happy for these hostages that they are home with their families.
Thank you.
But at the cost of hundreds of Palestinians, this is celebrated as a victory.
So here's the thing. Whenever you hear anybody talking about the number, right, they're trying to say that 275 is disproportional to saving 4 lives. That's what they're trying to argue. And my counterpoint to that is, what would be a proportional number? Who are you to dictate or condemn the loss of any life, right? Who are you to say how many Palestinians should be, quote unquote, rated for Israeli lives? It's disgusting. It's absolutely absurd. Every life has value. And when you start to get on this discussion of the number of lives that are, quote unquote, justified to be lost so that you can rescue 4 hostages, you're already on the wrong track. It's like dividing by 0. There is no correct answer to the number of lives. I challenge Krystal Ball or any of her supporters to spit out a number. Tell me a number that would be acceptable to have been lost on the Palestinian side for the rescue of 4 hostages. Should it be a 1-to-1 ratio? Should it be 2-to-1, 3-to-1? Should it be half to 1? You tell us, you tell me where you think the number should be and what gives you the audacity to trade those lives in exchange for 4 hostages. Every life lost is a tragedy, okay? I don't care if it's 1 Palestinian or 1,000. To the people who died, it's the world. They've lost their entire life for this, okay? So we're not trading marbles here. And nobody that brings up the numbers can ever tell you what would be an acceptable number. And when you bring up the numbers in a way that you're saying that this is too large of a number, surely the next question should be, what would be an acceptable number? And I haven't heard a single person that raises the numbers ever come back and say, this would be an acceptable number of lost. This would be the acceptable number of deaths. You don't have the authority or the audacity, you shouldn't have the audacity to pick a number. Every life lost is a tragedy. And these guys, they keep bringing up the numbers and the proportionality. I mean, what if it was 275 Palestinians lost to rescue all 100, let's say 100 hostages? Would that be okay? It's disgusting to be thinking about conflict and war and loss of life in terms of numbers. We're not trading marbles here. People's lives are at stake.
And, 1,000 dead and injured, more that are trapped under the rubble. And this is considered a victory. I mean, it just shows you how grotesque the immorality around this has become.
It's grotesque that you are quantifying numbers in terms of what would be just. Give us a number, Krystal. Give us a number, or otherwise stay quiet when it comes to the numbers. You're right. It is grotesque that we have to actually go and rescue hostages. You do understand that taking hostages is one of the most repugnant things that you can do even during a war. It is clearly deemed, illegal conduct under international war crimes and war laws, right? So let's start there. And once you kind of breach that barrier of I guess civility, even during war, which is a devastating, terrible tragedy to experience, but there's still some rules of engagement that combatants must adhere to. And once those rules are breached, it's, you can't look at it that way and say that Israel should only be willing to kill X amount of people so that they can rescue their hostages. If it's your life, it might as well be that the whole world died, right? Because you're losing your life because of this tremendous this conflict. So one life, 1,000 lives. We're not trading marbles here. Spit out a number. If anybody who raises these numbers, whether it's the entire war or a single event like what happened on Saturday, give us a number. What is the acceptable number that you think is okay to exchange lives, let's just say? And then my next question to you is, how dare you? How dare you have the audacity to pick a number? That would be my next response to you. So it's a trick question when I ask you, give me a number. There is no correct answer to what is an acceptable number.
Look, I think it's a tragedy, but this is a complicated one because this is one where they actually did achieve militarily what they had sought to. Now, listen, I will say this. The U.S. military does not conduct operations this way. They would never have pulled the trigger. The circumstances are a little bit difficult because what happened is that the vast majority of the deaths occurred after they had stormed the apartment building, and then apparently the vehicle that the Israelis were in broke down. They were getting fired on by RPGs, so they called it air support, basically clear out the road, take the hostages out, take them. I agree. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy, the number of civilians killed here. It also was like intentionally placed. I just think militarily, this is a very different operation than, let's say, carpet bombing the crap out of a refugee camp and saying, well, we hit a single terrorist. It was genuinely in support of a rescue, like hostage mission. You could see a Western operation like the U.S.
He makes a good point here that it appears to be that the Israeli mission to rescue these hostages over the weekend was a very surgical mission. And what appears to have happened is that once the hostages were rescued, the Hamas people realized what's happening, and they opened fire, right? I mean, one thing they could have done is they could let the hostages go, right? Seeing that they're in a heavily populated area, and they seeing that, let's say they got outsmarted or whatever happened, Israel came, they're about to rescue the hostages, let the hostages go at that point. But by them opening fire, they know that the Israelis are going to fire back. And of course, Hamas has set this entire situation in the middle of a civilian area, right? And that's Hamas's doing. So you can see the savagery that's happening here on the Hamas side. And the Hamas seems to be purely interested in increasing the loss of life because it's bad PR for Israel. And people like Krystal Ball are just walking right into that without seeing the big picture there.
Something like this go down in a similar situation where our guys get bogged down, the hostages are there, the vehicle, if they're in, you have to call in air support. At that point, it is a matter of life and death. I just think this one is a little bit different.
I don't think so.
No, it is. I mean, it's very different.
They bombed a crowded marketplace in the middle of the day.
Yeah, I mean, their troops were at risk.
Nearly 300 Palestinians murdered to rescue 4 people.
Again, what would be the number that's acceptable, Krystal? You can keep spewing this, doing the math, so to speak. And I think it's absolutely gross. You got to pick a number that would be acceptable to you. Otherwise, stop wasting everyone's time and stop being facetious by talking about the numbers. You give us a number, spit out a number that would be acceptable in terms of a ratio here.
People. You're right. I mean, on the one hand, our military would not have greenlit this operation. On the other hand, we were actually involved in some capacity. According to the New York Times, there was an American hostage recovery official stationed in Israel assisted in the Israeli military's effort by providing intelligence and other support. But going back to your comments, I mean, if you had Imagine Omar Badar, I'm taking this from he made this comment yesterday. I think it's so important. If you had Hamas massacre close to 300 Israelis to rescue 4 of their prisoners, by the way, Israel holds thousands of Palestinian hostages.
Okay, let's just stop right there. Israel is not holding Palestinian hostages. Israel has tried and imprisoned what it considers to be criminals. Now, to everybody out there that's upset about the detainees in Israel, what you're talking about is potentially criminal justice reform in Israel. You want to go and open those cases one by one and see if any of them are wrongfully convicted, that's fine. Go ahead and do that. But for you to equivocate 1-year-old that's right now being held hostage by Hamas to somebody who has been tried and convicted in a criminal court of probably terrorist activities in Israel is absolutely facetious. And you got to be careful about this kind of clever wordplay by some people in the media by just saying that Israel is holding hostages. No, Israel is not holding hostages. Israel didn't go into Palestine and snatch people out of their bedrooms at gunpoint and carry them over the border and is now holding them in some place. What happened is, again, there's thousands of potentially detainees in Israel. You got to go and look at all those cases one by one. And if you have grounds there for some type of appeal, criminal justice reform, you want to raise some kind of campaign because somebody was wrongfully imprisoned, be my guest and do that. But for you to equivocate a 1-year-old right now that is hostage, being held captive by Hamas, to these prisoners, these convicted criminals in Israel, is absolutely disingenuous at best.
No one would accept that. No one would accept that. Them going in and massacring innocent kids, women, civilians in a busy, crowded marketplace, taking out entire multi-story apartment buildings to get 4 people. No one would look at that math and say that that's acceptable. So why is it acceptable when it's Israeli?
I would flip it around and say, I think you're making a media point. I don't even disagree with you. I mean, obviously people in the media cut like a lot more slack, but I mean, any nation, group, etc., has the people. In this particular case, their people are at risk. They
also have a responsibility to follow the laws of war.
Well,
which,
I mean,
listen, Hamas held these hostages in residential areas. That is a war crime.
Yes.
Okay.
That does not alleviate the responsibility of Israel or any other nation to take precautions when it comes to civilians.
She's right about that. And I think Israel is taking precautions. Now let's see what she says next.
The fact that Hamas does something wrong doesn't give you a get out of jail free pass.
Correct.
And that's the way that they've acted. That's the entire justification for this entire genocide. They did bad things.
Again, you're using the word genocide, which is a legal conclusion. If you want to take Israel to court and try to convict them on genocide, go ahead. But for a reporter, a biased reporter like her, to be making the conclusive assertion that this is a genocide, again, that is a legal conclusion of whether or not something is a genocide or if it was an act of war. So you got to be careful with this, again, clever wordplay and conflation that happens by people that are either, I think, being facetious or they're just genuinely don't have the intellectual capacity to know that they're conflating acts of war with genocide.
They committed war crimes on October 7th. True. So that gives us a green light to do whatever the hell we want to do and not care one bit about Palestinian civilians.
What really should happen, I don't know what the repercussions are when a certain army does commit a war crime. Now, she's actually admitting that Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th. I think everyone's in agreement on that. I think the best course of recourse, the best recourse there for a belligerent army like Hamas that's committing war crimes, which I think is pretty universally agreed upon, would be to get an international coalition together to go after them. Why is that not happening? If we're admitting that Hamas committed war crimes on October 7th, if we're admitting that Hamas holding hostages now is a war crime, if we're admitting that Hamas taking the theater of war and putting it in a densely populated area is a war crime, and I think Krystal admits all that stuff, then I think the logical solution to that would be an international coalition that goes in there from a PR and military perspective. From a PR perspective, we would do collective condemnation on these war crimes. We can't have this. We can't allow this type of conduct to continue anytime a certain group or country has a grievance. Okay? Hostage taking needs to be disincentivized. And that's why people that are asking for a ceasefire deal, you are basically incentivizing Hamas and other bad actors to take hostages in the future, because they'll see, hey, look, we can take hostages. It is a war crime, but obviously there's no international condemnation or repercussions for that. And in fact, what happens when we take hostages is that they have to come to the table because they want their hostages so bad. So we basically have them by the balls and we can get any deal we want, like our own state or our own prisoners back or whatever. This cannot be allowed in the international theater. There needs to be an international coalition of condemnation and military action against Hamas because of their war crimes that Krystal admits to. Not, trying to label a surgical operation to go there and rescue 4 hostages as a massacre or as a war crime. She's completely backwards here.
I mean, this was the deadliest day we've seen in Gaza in months. It's wholly unjustifiable, especially.
Again, just repeating, and trying to pull, appeal to your heartstrings in terms of this. Yeah, we get it. There's a lot of people that lost their lives. In fact, if it's 275, we're hitting numbers of 30,000 people having lost their lives. So there's a lot other people that have lost their lives besides just what happened over the weekend. And it's all a tragedy.
Actually, given the context that there is a deal on the table to rescue all of the hostages without killing a single Palestinian civilian. So if Bibi Netanyahu and the rest of the military establishment and these far-right goons actually care about the hostages, then they would agree to the ceasefire deal that they supposedly put forward themselves. So it's not justifiable. And also, let's put this next piece up on the screen. They also, as part of this, disguise combatants in civilian clothing. This is a picture, by the way, this isn't fully verified, but this is the image that was floating around of this.
Not fully verified. So I think when you hear something like that, at least she's actually honest enough to say that. So you got to tune out. It is contested on whether or not they used any kind of civilian trucks. And to be honest with you, in my opinion, so what if they did? These guys are holding hostages, and using a civilian truck to get into the territory to get the hostages is an act of deception. It doesn't kill anybody by itself that you use civilian trucks. So although I guess it's illegal under international war crimes, and you can debate on whether or not it happened. You need an investigation to find out whether or not factually it happened. Like she said, it's not verified yet. So don't harp on these, what's called a red herring. This is a red herring. Let's get to the crux of the issue here, which is that you have a state actor in Hamas that is clearly committing war crimes, and the real question is how should the international community respond to that? What's going to happen if we reward Hamas with their own state after the atrocities of October 7th? Now, of course, some people are going to say it didn't start on October 7th and it goes way back, and we can have that discussion separately. But let's just say right now, for example, a completely unrelated, military group or some group of thugs, for example, in California, went somewhere and kidnapped a bunch of people because they want, prisoners released from, wherever, Mexico or wherever. Let's just say, how would you respond to that? I mean, these guys are clearly committing war crimes by taking hostages, right? Are you going to start getting into the nitty-gritty of, oh my God, these guys use a civilian truck to get into the premises to take out the terrorists? You're missing the point here. You're missing the forest for the trees. It's a red herring.
Civilian vehicle aid truck. This is a helicopter that landed right by the quote unquote humanitarian pier. The U.S. is saying, oh no, we had nothing to do with it. We didn't use the pier, et cetera, et cetera. But that helicopter is literally right next to the pier. So you make of that what you will. But put this next piece up on the screen. This is from Ken Roth. Disguising combatants in civilian clothing to commit hostilities constitutes perfidy. That is a war crime. And this is not from, Palestinian sources, which nobody seems to believe. This is from Israeli news sources. Israel's rescue team reportedly entered the area in a furniture truck driven by a female soldier in civilian clothes. There's a good reason why this is a war crime.
Why?
Which is, if you're using civilian trucks, if you're using especially humanitarian aid trucks, think of how much danger aid workers have already been in this conflict. So now you're basically putting an even greater target on their back, because there's a suspicion now, if you see an aid truck, that it.
She makes a good point. I'll give it to her there. And I guess if this is a recognized war crime, then it should be discouraged. But you've also put the Israelis in a very tough place here, because they want to go and retrieve their hostages. This is not in a military zone where there's tanks and missile launchers. We're talking about a densely populated bazaar. We're talking about a densely populated market and street here. And I can't see any other way that the Israelis could have gotten to the hostages without some type of act of deception. So, make of it what you can. No, war is messy. It's not perfect. Let's try to end the war. And of course, for some of you out there, you're going to say, well, we can end the war if Israel, stops the occupation or whatnot. If you want to talk about diplomatic solutions, let's jump over to diplomatic solutions and we can talk about diplomatic solutions. But once we're in war, which is right now, we're in active conflict, little bit, bets are off. As you can see, Hamas is not being an angel, and they're certainly violating some international war crimes. And Israel too, I think might bend the rules a little bit. It's unfortunate on both sides. Now, Israel, let's just continue.
Could be IDF soldiers coming in to commit another massacre. So that's why that's considered a war crime.
But this is where I just disagree. It's like, well, then all, U.S. special operations are quote unquote a war crime. It's ridiculous. I mean, our people have
What are you talking about?
What, you think we haven't sent CIA agents and Delta Force operatives disguised in civilian garb to go smash and grab or rescue our own hostages or rescue Westerners? Of course we have. We've done it many times.
In an aid truck is another level.
Okay, sure. Aid truck, yeah, I agree. I wouldn't do it. Obviously, the Israelis are going to be doing different things. But this is what I'm saying about the whole discourse around quote unquote war crime, etc. It's a lot of it is just a farce. It's not the way that people actually operate in a military environment. I think this one is
clearly not the way they operate.
I mean, when you think about it, yeah, I think he makes a good point. It's a war, right? It's a war. Have you ever heard of the term "all is fair in love and war"? That's why wars should be avoided. And I think there's definitely a hierarchy of how bad a war crime can be. Using an aid truck to deceive your enemy, I think, is on the lower side of culpability, right? And I think, or immorality, so to speak. And I think, taking hostages out of their bed, taking civilians out of their beds and dragging them over the border so that you can hold them up inside a densely populated area, that's multiple war crimes. Whole different ball game there.
Military environment. But the reason that we had it is so we have language to talk about why it is wrong and why it should be out of bounds. And so that there is some way to put pressure and not just, they can murder people. So why not? Let's just look the other. I guess it's fine. They got 4 people. So, 300 and injuring another 700 and reducing another entire neighborhood to rubble. I guess it's fine because they can do it.
No, it's that look, at the end of the day, they were also under a huge amount of fire. This was a very different environment. They're under RPG.
So if you want the hostages back, do the ceasefire deal.
I agree.
You don't have to murder a single Palestinian.
Again, asking a country to do a deal while the other side is holding hostages is asking a country to do a deal while they are under duress. Okay, as a lawyer myself, I would never advise a client to enter into a deal while under duress, right? And if you don't know what under duress is, go and look it up. It's basically saying that you're being coerced. You have a proverbial gun to your head, that you're being forced to make a deal. This is not how deals are made. If Hamas wants to negotiate a diplomatic deal, it needs to A, release the hostages, and then B, you shouldn't have even started the October 7 attack. Go to the boardroom and see if you can do a deal.
There don't have to be little kids with their limbs blown off and getting amputations with no anesthetic and no mom and no dad. And by the way, a lot of hatred in their hearts, and God knows what they're going to want to do when they grow up.
I agree that substantively different than a lot of the carpet bombing operation that we've seen all throughout Gaza, the intentional withholding of humanitarian aid, etc. But like, are we really going to say that operators are not to go into a war environment and not, be
in humanitarian aid trucks? Yes.
I mean, look, I'm just not going to say that because given the fact that any U.S. citizen or others who are, if I ever get, abducted, do whatever you need in order to get me back. And I think
that's how everybody feels. And that's why you can't abduct people, because people are likely to cross the line so that they can rescue them. Abducting somebody or taking someone hostage is such a repulsive act that it brings out a kind of a primal instinct in us to go and get that person back, whether or not that person is your family or if just one of your countrymen. This is exactly why taking hostages is illegal, because it brings out the worst in people in terms of trying to get them back.
That's how a lot of
do a ceasefire deal.
Well,
Sagar, that's the thing. You're pretending like this was the only option. Murdering 300 people and injuring 700 others.
Again, we are not doing a ceasefire deal under duress, Krystal. Get that through your head. It is absurd to expect somebody to enter into a deal while there's hostages being held. They got to release the hostages first. You want to enter into a good faith deal or a bad faith deal? You can't request the government to enter into a deal like this while there's a proverbial gun to their head by way of holding their hostages. It's absolutely absurd. If these guys really want to do a deal so bad, they could have done a deal on October 6th.
Others, that was the only, no. And by the way, guess what? The reports are from the health ministry that other hostages were killed, including potentially an American citizen.
That's purely propaganda by Hamas. That is pure propaganda by Hamas, kind of psychological warfare, trying to, make Israelis regret their actions, saying 3 more hostages got killed. In fact, one of them was American, so they're kind of pulling America into it. So the way, look at her smug face, and the way that she's kind of repeating Hamas talking points as if it's some kind of basis for us to make decisions. She's absolutely off the deep end here, I think, intellectually, and somebody needs to reel her back in.
That's possible.
Unconfirmed report.
Yeah,
okay, that's not confirmed.
Unconfirmed
but
report.
We do know that we had a quote from Israeli hostages, just one of the ones that just released, who was talking to Haaretz, who said, our greatest fear was the idea of bombing that we heard. So don't talk to me about, this is fine because it got the hostages back. No, if you care about the hostages, do the ceasefire deal. That's what Benny Gantz, who, I'm no fan of, that's what he's saying. That's what the Israeli public is demanding. The military spokesperson, Daniel Hagari, is saying, this is not sustainable. The way to get the hostages back isn't to murder little kids. It's to do a ceasefire deal and end this war. So no, I don't think it's excusable. And if you look at past historical examples of successful hostage rescue missions, there was a thread that somebody put out online. I wish I had it in front of me, but you'll see 0 civilians killed, maybe 3 civilians killed, 200.
Yeah, but you have to compare that to the fact that Hamas is purposely trying to get its civilians killed because of the PR value, which Krystal is walking right into. Hamas deliberately wants to increase the death count because of PR value, because useful idiots like Krystal buy right into it, and they start the whole narrative with, 300 civilians killed and their brains were gushing out and stuff like that, so they can pull on your heartstrings. Yes, it hurts everybody. It's sad for anybody to die, every single human being. But you got to take Hamas out of leadership. They're the ones that are trying to get civilians killed. They're the ones that put less value on human life than anybody else that's involved in this conflict.
And 70? No, it's not proportionate. It's not acceptable, especially, again, when there is a deal on the table that could bring all the hostages home and not require a single death.
I don't disagree that they should take the ceasefire deal. I agree the U.S. military never would have done this. We have a much higher level of professionalism, thank God, in terms of the people that we run. Our substantive disagreement is about the idea that you're not allowed to use military force in the course of a hostage rescue mission, which, look.
Did I say that?
No, but that
I didn't say that.
No, but
yeah,
that's
so then how is that the disagreement?
But that's what happened. happened.
No,
They went
300
they
people
grabbed their
killed
hostages.
is unacceptable.
In the middle of that operation, their car broke down because they were getting RPGs and machine guns fired at them, and they called in air support. They did the exact same thing that any Western-style military would do in the exact same
provided
situation.
cover and bombing on the way in and the way out. They did it during the day when there was a busy marketplace there, and that's how so many civilians were murdered. Not to mention, they took out multiple residential buildings, not just the 2 that the hostages were being held in. Not to mention, very possible that they killed their own hostages in this operation. We wouldn't have done it. It's not acceptable. We have also committed war crimes. I'm not like excusing us and pretending like we're angels, but I just don't see how you look at this and say this was fine. This was acceptable. Well, that seems to be what you're arguing.
I think it is substantively different than many of the other things that have been committed. And
no, but they say the same thing. They say, "Oh, well, we bombed the refugee. Well, you got a Hamas baddie, so it's fine. We accomplished our military goal."
Obviously ridiculous.
And how is this different?
Because they were in the middle of a rescue operation. Exactly. This literally is different. Whenever
insanely disproportionate. Insanely disproportionate.
What would be proportionate?
I mean, it's outrageous to say that it's acceptable to have 300 dead to rescue 4 people when you could get them all.
What would be the number, Krystal? Give us a number that would be acceptable, because the ceasefire deal is not acceptable to us right now because we are under duress. We will get our hostages back, and we're happy to explore diplomatic solutions. But that ship has sailed, or at least it's off the dock until the hostages are returned. We're not going to enter into a deal while there's hostages being held. A 1-year-old is being held hostage.
Of the hostages and protect all of the hostages who are again at risk because of the IDF bombing operation without killing a single person. I just can't agree with this whatsoever.
But the reason that I'm pushing back, Krystal, is because of exactly like the Ken Roth rhetoric. This idea that, you're never you can't dress in civilian garb. I mean, I just think at a certain point, we all need to stop living in a fantasy land where everybody is just going to be abiding by the laws of war.
Oh, we're not living in a fantasy land.
No,
we're living in a nightmare.
Yeah.
People in Gaza are living in hell on earth. And so it's disgusting to me that we have US politicians who claim this as a victory when, again, if the shoe was on the other foot and it was 4 Palestinian hostages who were rescued in an operation that killed hundreds of Israelis, no one.
These get killed by a battle, right? So, and I think we all saw what the public reaction was when 1,200 Israelis got killed on October 7th. So I don't know, again, if she's got a short memory or then she's just purposely being facetious here, but you got to watch out to the one-sidedness. You got to watch out to the bias here. You got to be privy to the distortion of reality that she's trying to weave here by A, pulling on your emotional heartstrings, B, using numbers, talking about the numbers without giving you a number of what would be an acceptable number, and then not understanding the realities of a war, saying that, I don't know, I guess Israel shouldn't have tried to rescue the hostages, or maybe they should have made a calculation of how many people would have died. And if the calculation was too high, they shouldn't have done it. Or maybe it's Israel's, maybe they did do the calculation and the number of, Palestinians that are going to be killed was going to be 25, but then Hamas opened fire. It rose the number to 270. So now whose fault is that? Again, it's just, this is the kind of stuff that completely toxic, news coverage here.
It was okay. But because Palestinians are so dehumanized and considered so inconsequential, it's just fine to wave your hand, as it's fine for it to be collateral damage.
Like I said, I think you're arguing against media personalities, which I don't even necessarily disagree with. What I'm saying, and honestly though, if I was looking at it from a Hamas perspective, I was 4 of our guys needed to be rescued, and then people were shooting at the people who were going to go rescue them, and you did whatever it took in order to get them out, I'd be like, yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but if I was in their position, I'd probably do the exact same thing. Most rational nation states and or military groups would do that.
That's not true. You just said that we wouldn't do it.
No. Well,
you just said we wouldn't do it, Sagar.
We would not plan an operation this way, but if we found ourselves in a situation
then point to the example where we did something
equivalent. It's been a long time.
Point to a single example. No.
Caleb Mueller, I think, was our last rescue
I'm not saying we're perfect, right? We commit war crimes also. I've been very critical. But you can't say any rational nation state would do it and also say we never would have done it.
No, I said we wouldn't plan a military operation this way, but in a similar circumstance, though, if our people were under fire in the middle of a hostage rescue mission, there was no other way to get out, absolutely, U.S. military would probably pull the trigger
back,
in the same way.
But you can't point to an example where it's happened.
Well, that's what I said. I don't even know the last time I had a major rescue operation. I want to say it was Kayla Mueller under ICE. It was almost, I think, 7-8 years ago since the last time. Now, we've operated in a very different environment. I can't necessarily say same thing. I think, again, we have a much higher level of professionalism and conduct than the way that they execute military operations. But the disagreement, as I said, is both about the difference in the way that they're quote unquote killing terrorists and terrorizing the population as opposed to a single thing. And my big disagreement is with a lot of this idea that, that we're just supposed to conduct military operations in some sort of world where everybody just abides by the laws of war. It's not like they weren't getting shelled, shot at, and bombed by Hamas on their way out, which is what happened.
I think we should avoid massacre
I agree, it would be
hundreds of innocent civilians. Okay. And by the way, there's a hostage deal on the table. And by the way, this puts hostages further at risk. And by the way, it fuels the hatred that will lead to more terrorism in the future.
Is she just repeating herself here? I mean,
this was a political play for Bibi Netanyahu in order to keep his grip.
This is not a political play. The entire mission since October 8th has been to rescue the hostages, A, and then get Hamas out of power, B. So this is just absolutely absurd biased coverage here.
On power at the expense of 1,000 Palestinians between the dead and the injured. Okay, there was nothing justifiable about it. And I think it is a disgusting worldview that just dismisses this level of quote unquote collateral damage as being acceptable in any context. Move on.
Okay, but this is what I'm saying. You can't just call it a disgusting worldview.
It is.
Then there's no operation ever where the right of self-defense or military, hostage rescue can happen under this. It's just not.
No,
it's literally
that's not
impossible.
True, Saber.
You're
that
finding
is
a
not
specific context.
true.
I'm talking in a bigger generality. Which, look, I have not disagreed that there shouldn't be a ceasefire deal, but I'm sorry, this is just that is frankly a pie in the sky worldview where everybody signs the Geneva Convention.
Yeah, you know what? The reality is, I would like to live in that world, but I acknowledge I don't live in that world. But even
well, the problem is that you're dealing with the other side, which is absolutely breaching all war crimes, right? So at least Israel is trying to hold itself to a somewhat of a standard, which is what Sagar is saying, is that it's not an idealistic situation where everybody is going to follow rules of engagement to a T. Ideally, it would be. Ideally, we wouldn't even have wars. But, I guess if we're going to have wars, what she's trying to say is that people would fight like quote unquote gentlemen, right? And they would maintain the, adherence to the international rules of war. But when you're dealing with a psychopathic, irrational party in Hamas that repeatedly breaches multiple war crimes, you're really in a tough spot there in terms of for you to be, squeaky clean in your defense or your response to their atrocities. The reason that, again, half the reason that these civilians got killed is because Hamas brought the war into a populated civilian area, right? They're purposely hiding in civilian homes. They're purposely not wearing uniforms and wearing civilian clothes. The combatants are. So Israel has its hands full in terms of dealing with somebody or an opponent that has no adherence to the rules of war. And nevertheless, Israel, you can say it's quote unquote doing its best. If it's not good enough for you, hey, you're welcome to condemn Israel, but you have no sense of understanding, as Sagar is saying here, of the reality of war. You're living in La La Land. Okay, this is war. This is life and death situation. I know for a lot of us here in the US, we don't know what it's like to have a missile flying over our head. But when you get into these war zones, into these combat zones, it's a completely different ballgame. And again, I think Israel should hold itself to the standard of international war crimes and international rules of engagement. But to expect Israel to be quote unquote squeaky clean, while at the same time excusing all of Hamas's deliberate breaching of war crimes and the rules of engagement, then you're being biased.
Acknowledging the imperfect world we live in, you also have to admit that our military wouldn't have greenlit this operation, that you can't point to another hostage rescue mission that led to hundreds of deaths. And so to pretend like this is all fine and good and just in the normal course of operations, no, this is outrageously outside of what.
This is an outrageous situation. There's a 1-year-old being held hostage. I mean, do you understand that? There's a 1-year-old being held hostage. Do you understand that, Krystal?
The world has looked like and what quote unquote rational nation state actors, including our own very imperfect country, has done in the past.
No, what, again, like I'm just going to reiterate, come down to what it was going to look like in the context of an actual military operation whenever you're literally rescuing hostages, a vehicle breaks down. It's like, what are you supposed to do? You know, you're going to die or you're going to get your way out. There actually is a zero-sum game whenever it comes down to that exact situation.
You are supposed to protect civilians. You are supposed to, if you are a soldier, guess what? Part of your responsibility is to risk your life to protect civilians.
Not to mention that even on an ordinary day, if you're walking down somewhere in Gaza, you have no idea who's a civilian and who's a combatant because the combatants don't wear military uniforms. So Krystal, see, and this is exactly, I think this really highlights the point. Krystal is expecting the Israeli soldiers to, you know, you're sitting in your Humvee, right? And you have a hostage that you've just rescued. You're being shelled and attacked and fired upon by, you know, deadly weapons from various sides. You look out the window and Krystal wants the U.S. military to distinguish between civilians and combatants in that situation. And not to mention that everyone's dressed the same. All the civilians and the combatants are dressed the same. And that's deliberate by Hamas. This is exactly what I mean with, and I think Saga's trying to explain to her that she has zero context, right? This is people who, I don't know, took some kind of, you know, went to journalism school or got some kind of 4-year degree, and they have this idealistic worldview, and they have no ability to kind of put themselves in the shoes of those soldiers at that moment that they're getting fired upon. Look, if that soldier looks out the window, there's no way that that soldier can distinguish between combatants and civilians because they're all wearing the same clothes. Hamas does not wear uniforms. And that would be on a normal day. On a normal day, you wouldn't be able to distinguish. In the fog of war, where there's in an active combat zone, where there's, you know, gunfire being exchanged, you think then she wants Israeli soldiers to distinguish between a civilian and a combatant? It's absolutely ridiculous. You have zero perspective, Krystal.
I agree with that.
Okay,
Yes.
well, that's not what happened here. Okay,
Well,
so
no, but
and
also,
again, don't greenlight such a dangerous operation to start with if it's going to potentially lead to hundreds of deaths. And if you care about the hostages, do the ceasefire deal. So I just, you know, on every level, I find it outrageous that this is considered in any
Completely unrealistic and completely biased.
way justifiable or acceptable.
I would put it just, look, I agree that the ceasefire deal should happen. And in some ways, I think we're almost talking past each other. But is a lot of the worldview that is put forward, I would say, by progressive left in the context of this conflict just leaves no room for like a military to operate. And in a military to operate in a manner which I think is quote unquote justifiable, not necessarily saying in this particular instance. What I mean by that is hostage rescues, the ability to conduct war, you know, this idea that you're not supposed to disguise yourself.
Sagar, how can we at this point? I mean, it's, listen, the official number is close to 40,000 dead. We both know it's probably far more than
Probably
that.
100.
So that more bombs have been dropped on Gaza Strip than in World War II. The devastation is more extensive than Dresden, right? When we know you have the largest population of child amputees in the world.
So whenever you hear this stuff, you got to think to yourself, did Hamas know that Israel was going to retaliate this way, or was Hamas surprised? I think that's a fair question. Do you think that Hamas's military wing, when they're doing the analysis, right, when they're thinking a few steps ahead, when they were planning October 7th, do you think anyone in the room said, hey, Israel has, a pretty sophisticated military, and the chances of them, retaliating to October 7th, not to mention the fact that we're going to have some of their hostages, but even if without hostages, they're going to retaliate to October 7th with massive military action that's going to lead to tremendous civilian casualties on our side. And us, Hamas, we don't have the military might to be able to fight one-on-one, soldier to soldier, with the Israeli military because of their advanced weapon system. Of course, some of that weapons is supported by the United States. It doesn't change the fact that they have the advanced weapon systems. You don't think anybody from the Hamas military anticipated that the reaction is going to lead to substantial civilian loss of life? Or do you think they did anticipate it, and consistent with their kind of glorification of martyrdom, they said, hey, we welcome that type of reaction because it's going to be tremendously bad press for the Israelis? And that's exactly what Krystal is walking into. And most of the media walked right into Hamas's playbook by blaming Israel for the retaliation and basically treating Hamas like children, as if they didn't know, that there's going to be retaliation. I mean, these are military people whose job it is to do war games and make predictions on how a country might react to a certain event. Of course, even if they weren't certain that Israel is going to react that way, it could have at least been a possible outcome, right, during the planning stage. So spare me the, BS here in terms of trying to blame the death count on Israel. Hamas knew or should have known that Israel was going to react the way it did.
When we know that starvation has been used as a tool of war, when we know that our political class and the Israeli political class and the entire Israeli society, with very few extremely brave exceptions, so trivializes Palestinian lives that hundreds of Palestinians being murdered to rescue 4 people is considered acceptable. When we have seen what's happened over all these months, how are you going to criticize the progressive left, or whatever terminology you use, for saying that this is unacceptable? Listen, I was never someone who said that there was absolutely no room for any sort of military operation in the wake of October 7th. Mm-hmm. But as we've discussed from the beginning, the way they've gone about it from the jump has been unacceptable from their own national security interests. And
maybe it was unacceptable, but let me ask you, Krystal, was it anticipated? Was it anticipated? Was it anticipated, do you think?
Certainly from the interests of respecting any sort of humanitarian and lives of Palestinians. I mean, you have people who are starving to death. You have a famine. You have humanitarian aid that is completely blocked. You have an entire hospital system that is completely decimated. And so to say it's been unreasonable to object to the way that I find that completely outrageous.
That's not what I said. What I said is it's unreasonable to expect that. It is unreasonable to apply, let's say, the same level of outrage, logic, etc., that we would on a bombing a military or a refugee camp, or leveling a building in order to kill 1 or 2 people who allegedly may or may not have been there, as opposed to an operation where the fire was, according to the Washington Post and according to the Financial Times, occurred after the hostages were successfully rescued and their vehicle broke down as a result of Hamas RPGs, machine gun fire, and there basically was a zero-sum game where they were either going to die or live and be able to shoot their way out. That is a very, very different situation, and one in which collateral damage is genuinely a tragedy, but is very, very different than how we would have looked at if you had the option to do. Look,
listen, if you buy that logic, that's the same as accepting, like, oh, but the refugee camp, they killed 200.
I think. I'll tell you why.
No, hold on, let me finish. Because they say we got 2 Hamas. It was a legitimate military target. There were 2 Hamas bad guys. We got those bad guys. Collateral damage. It's sad,
but
guess what?
It's substantively different.
It's war. War is hell.
In this particular case, they actually did send special operating troops into the ground. Didn't kill that many people on the way in. Allegedly, at least according to the multiple write-ups and other things that I have seen, and that the vast majority the casualties were suffered after they actually did what I have been saying they should have been done from the beginning, which is put their own soldiers at risk and grab their hostages in order to get them out. And or if you want to kill a terrorist in a refugee camp, you should do exactly this. You should drop people down on the ground and you should go and kill them, and then you should get yourself out.
So I think we also need to acknowledge that those reports are coming from what the IDF is saying to.
Sure. I mean, well, what else are we supposed to do? I mean, we have a limited amount of.
Listen to Palestinians who are on the ground who are talking about what happened.
Yeah, and there's the vast majority of the deaths.
So why did they have to decimate multiple apartment buildings that weren't holding hostages? What about that? What about the people who were buried under the rubble in these apartment buildings that had nothing to do with holding hostages? What about the air cover that they provided, quote unquote, air cover that they provided on the way in, which also included gunfire and bombing?
It was necessary, Krystal. Do you not understand that it was all necessary for them to be able to get out alive? And do you not understand that if the reports are true, the majority of the gunfire happened after the hostages were in Israeli custody, then it's clear that Hamas is just upset that this happened, and they want to get as many people killed as they can, so that idiots like Krystal can throw this 300 number out there and say, look at the ratio, look at the ratio. Honestly, if Hamas was a little bit more judicious with its response, a little bit more caring for civilian lives, maybe 10 Palestinians would get killed. Of course, 10 Palestinians for 4 Israelis is still a disparity. And I'm sure a lot of people would be upset at that ratio. And as I'm saying, every single loss is a tragedy, irrespective of the ratio. But she's completely failing. And she says, trust the Hamas people on the ground. You mean the Hamas people whose entire PR strategy is to get more people killed so that people like Krystal can sit here and blame Israel for all the deaths? So completely lack of perspective. I don't know why people listen to her.
So, I mean, listen, I think we should just move on because we're obviously not going to agree on this. And, I think it's wholly unacceptable to think that 4 hostages, and by the way, other hostages possibly killed and put at risk in exchange for 300 Palestinian lives and another 700 who have been, maimed and seriously injured, and more reportedly under the. I think that that's acceptable or justifiable. We're just not gonna agree.
We can move on.
All right, there was another thing that.
Okay, so I thought that was just a good exercise there, but you see that. You see bias, you see lack of perspective, you see the inability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, all demonstrated by Krystal Ball here. And I think these types of attitudes are very prevalent in contemporary media culture. And I think it's good to ask questions of why, and also logically deduce from their conclusions and ask a follow-up question. When someone says 300 people died for four hostages being released or rescued, and they're upset about that ratio, you got to come back with, well, what is an acceptable ratio? What is an acceptable ratio? I think that's my primary issue with, I think, a lot of the news that's been coming out from this weekend and the hostage rescue mission, which is that people are upset about the ratio, but nobody seems to have a response, for me at least, in terms of what is an acceptable ratio. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this podcast, make sure to like and subscribe to the Contemporary Happiness channel on YouTube. I'm David Nima, your host, and I'll see you all in the next episode.